Welcome to the Masculinity Unmasked podcast with hosts Greg Stein, Max Wilson, and Linda Tilson.
Okay, hello and welcome everyone to another episode of the Masculinity Unmasked podcast, the fortnightly conversation which delves deep into the issues impacting men today. We're here to have the conversations you might not be having elsewhere. Honest, open, sometimes uncomfortable, but always important. The title for today's episode is Resilience, Healing, and the Courage to be Vulnerable. And I am very lucky to be joined by Eugene Z. Bertrand, who is the author of Resilience, Breaking the Chains. So, Eugene, thanks very much for joining me today. Do you want to start by sharing a little bit about your story and the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. Linda, thank you so much for having me. So, yeah, my story really began with silence. So, I grew up navigating the effects of domestic violence, something that wasn't always talked about, especially for men. And I learned very early on that silence was survival, but it also became a form of pain. And so, I spent years trying to be strong by hiding what hurt. And so, today I'm a Master of Social Work candidate at Columbia University, and I am working in a forensic setting, helping to humanize clients. And my work now really centers on storytelling, resilience, and trauma, doing my part in helping people connect their stories to who they become and reminding them really of the fact that healing is possible, even in the most broken spaces.
So, Eugene, what you shared about your background is that you bring a lens of history and education. And in what ways would you say education serves as both a form of social justice and trauma recovery?
That's a good question, Linda. I feel like education was really my first form of healing. Growing up, I struggled. I had ADHD and a learning disability, and I recognized very early on that learning it wasn't necessarily about like the grades that you get, but really about understanding yourself and the way that your own brain thinks. And I'm a firm believer that education, when it's done right, it becomes a huge tool for things like liberation. And I really feel like it can really help people reclaim their stories and see that, they're more than what might have happened to them. And I really feel that, when schools become trauma informed and really emotionally aware, they become spaces for justice. So I also, yeah, and I just feel like well, you mentioned that education served both as a form of social justice and recovery. And I also wanted to mention that, that means like not punishing behavior that comes from pain, but really doing our part as educators and supportive folks that are in the school system to try to understand it, which means teaching social and emotional intelligence and really encouraging kids starts young, in my opinion, to name their feelings and manage them.
I couldn't agree more with that. I really truly believe that adding the social emotional intelligence in the schools is an excellent foundation because we all know that, unless you have a background or an experience that exposes you to talking about your feelings and to being able to express yourself. And what I want to bring it back to is what you had mentioned. You vulnerably shared that you struggled with ADHD and a learning disability,
Uh,
and that what you want people to know that are listening to this podcast, young people anywhere, in life as well, on the other side, educators, practitioners, to know that probably the number one thing is that people understand that they are more than a diagnosis. They're more than what has happened to them. Because
Yeah.
I think that a person's identity can really get wrapped around a diagnosis or an experience. And that's really hard when you wrap yourself around that identity, and instead of saying, "I am this wonderful person," "I am a person that has ADHD. I am a
Mhm.
person that survived domestic abuse." And it's like, "No, you are not those things. They're experiences that happen to you, and they're important
Yeah.
to acknowledge and to heal from, but they're not who you are."
Yeah. I struggled with that when I was very young as well, because everybody else, Linda, was able to kind of catch on to things much more easier than I was and much more faster than I was. But, I think what I recognized was that I recognized it very earlier on that, you cannot compare yourself to people. And, when I tell my clients and when I tell folks today, even just in having conversations like with my friends, I always make it a point to just kind of remind folks that it's you versus you. Like, you don't have to be in competition with anybody else but yourself. But I think we also have to kind of create the space to recognize that, it's you're human and, everybody walks a part of their life where they are similarizing themselves with somebody else or comparing themselves with somebody else. And I think that's a human thing that people do. But I think it's really important just to kind of catch that when it happens and then recognize the strengths that you bring to the table as well. Because a lot of people think that, when you have things like ADHD, that means that you can't focus. That means that you can't concentrate. And that's not always the reality. At least for me, I was able to concentrate. I just really had to figure out in which way I was able to best concentrate. For me, it wasn't just sitting in front of an educator being lectured. And for me, I needed to have something like a pen in my hand to I could just kind of like draw like on a paper and just draw circles because having that movement in my hand is also connecting to my brain and that allows me to stay focused and concentrate. So yeah, you bring up a really good point there.
Thank you. And also speaking to the comparison, comparison is the thing that robs the joy out of living life,
Yeah.
and so many of us do it. I mean,
Yeah.
when we want to come out of the gate, let's say doing something that's new for us that we've never done before,
Yeah.
we want it to be right the first time, and
Yeah.
then when it's not, we start looking around, and to your point, we wanna be better than our version of ourself that's learning and growing and extend that compassion, and so this brings me to the next question that I have for you is, many people genuinely want to help someone that's struggling or someone that's, in this case, so let's say they're learning something new and they have good intentions, but they don't always translate into effective support. Knowing this, you are, let's say, doing something new or you're struggling, either one, you could answer the question. From your perspective, what are some of the common mistakes that well intentioned individuals make when they're trying to support somebody?
That's a really good question, Linda. I'm really happy that you asked that because especially when you're in the helping profession, so my field, so social work, I think the biggest, let's say one of the most common mistakes are that folks tend to do is rush to fix someone instead of really just kind of listening to them and trying to meet their needs by holding space and really trying to understand, you know, what they feel like they're ready for. I think sometimes people just need presence. They don't always need advice. And I've had to learn that over the years myself. Like if I'm being very honest, Linda, I'm a very different person than I was 4 years ago. I had to learn that, not everybody is looking for, you know, advice. What they're kind of looking for is just a listening ear, somebody to lean on. And, I've recognized that when we try to solve somebody's pain too quickly, we risk kind of having the opportunity to send a message that, their feelings are inconvenient or they're not valid. And I feel like in doing the work of social work and just even just an everyday conversation, you have to make sure that, whoever you're talking to, they feel like their feelings are valid. You don't always have to agree with it, but if they feel like they have a sense of agency and you're able to kind of hold the space to allow them to feel like they have that sense of agency and autonomy, by just being present and letting them know that, that you're there, I think that can go, so far. And, I think as I say this, I think another thing that comes up is comparing pain, right? Like saying things like, oh, it could be worse. I think that shuts people down. And I believe that, true compassion means just really kind of meeting someone where they are, not where you think that they should be. And I'm a firm believer that things like healing um, it happens in spaces where people feel seen, heard, respected, validated, not managed.
Thank you for unpacking that.
Uh,
What you're saying is, getting into this work as a social work and or like in my case, coaching and guiding. That's one of the lessons I had to learn too,
yeah,
because it's one thing you're like, oh, I need to go into this space and then guide the way through the practical way a person could approach something.
yeah,
And so really when a person is struggling or they've experienced something traumatic or something that they're having difficulty with in their emotions, the last thing they want is for you to come in and say, "This is where you could begin, and have you taken these steps?" And starting there, no, it's about, like you said, being present and
yeah,
listening, acknowledging, and not invalidating. And one of the things that, we can do through storytelling is to share one of our experiences to be relatable. And that is like the worst place to start off with, because what it does is do exactly what you said. It invalidates the experience that they're having because
yeah.
you are bringing in a well-intentioned way, and a lot of times your experience, and so then it takes away from what they're trying to express.
Linda.
So, you know,
Exactly.
that what it does is indirectly it says, "Well, I went through this, and this is where you could be or should be, and here I am sharing this with you. Take this great
Yeah,
tool and run with it." And the best way is for a person to come to that realization when they're speaking to you about their experience, and maybe some space and time happens where they actually get to sit with themselves. And the best thing that can happen is that in that time that they're sitting with themselves and thinking about it, processing it, and they come back and say, "You know what? I had this aha moment where I realized this is what I can be doing. This is how I'm going to do it. And I'm so happy to share that this is where I came to as a result of you holding space for me, you listening and acknowledging I got there myself."
yeah, and I think as well, like I think self-disclosure it can be both a good and a bad thing. I think it's great like when you're kind of like trying to establish rapport, but again, it can come off as invalidating somebody's experiences, and it can come off as, my time's not being, so I think it's really important that we just kind of hold space and really do our part to be emotionally and socially focused on when somebody's really trying to share their experiences. And I'm not even talking about in like a clinical coaching or like forensic setting, right? But I mean just genuinely like in your everyday life in different social contexts, just trying to be present and not always trying to solve the problem all the time, I think can really go such a long way and will allow people to feel like, if I am feeling a certain way, I can go talk to Linda. If I'm feeling a certain way and I don't really know who to talk to, I can talk to Eugene. I think just opening that space and holding space for those emotions, I think is very, very important.
You're absolutely right, just on a human to human level outside of any construct of being a professional of any sort is doing that. And that really leads to the question that I have is like at a societal level, how do we, I guess, bring that thought that you just mentioned about let take our coaching hat off, or let's take our social worker hat off, and how do we convey that thought of like just coming together as a human and having those conversations where we are truly present in the best of way. Because it's one thing to say you're present, you're holding space, but are you really the way you would go about that? It's really just unlearning, I guess, to some extent of that structure that we're trying to hold, and an absence of structure, you can have presence.
Y- You know, That's a really good question, Linda. And, I think my response to that would be that the more that we understand our emotions, the more we can respond instead of react. And I think in order to do those things, it's really important to just kind of normalize emotional literacy the same way that we teach math, English, science. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have to really kind of normalize those things. And again, that brings me back to social and emotional learning. I learned a lot in obtaining my degree in education for my bachelor's, because I recognize that, that's something that should be a part of our culture in workplaces, justice systems, schools. It really allows people the opportunity to recognize the humanity and the person in others, and really do our part in communicating empathy.
So, as an educator, how do you go about implementing something like that? Or have you implemented something like that? Because for me, I think you would like request a meeting to go into a place and space that can benefit from that. What are your thoughts on that?
I have a few thoughts, Linda. I think that I feel like social emotional learning, it has to start with the educator. I think you have to really kind of do your part in showing students what it looks like to name emotions and handle them in healthy ways. And I think that could also, well, I'll go there after. And I think if you're feeling overwhelmed as an educator, you can say, I'm noticing that, because I was dealing with elementary school kids. So I'd probably say something like, I'm noticing that I'm feeling a little frustrated right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a deep breath before we keep going. Because if you're demonstrating that, it can create a ripple effect, and that'll show students that this is emotional honesty, this is emotional vulnerability. And, I think while this can happen in a school setting, this can also happen at home. You have to kind of do your part and name those emotions so kids can see that, so then they can repeat those same things. Because you have to think about it too. Like, kids have to learn how to walk. You know what I'm saying? They have to transition from a baba to an actual glass of water. You know what I'm saying? So, and I really think that creating a safe space is really important in doing that and implementing SEO. And I really believe that safety builds trust, and things like consistency really build safety.
You're right, and, as a parent, I'm always looking to how to have those conversations with my kids, and so 2 of them are adults now, and one is on the cusp of adulthood, and so
Yeah.
we have conversations around expressing of feelings and, showing up authentically as yourself. What does that mean? So we talk a lot about that, but what if you're a parent and you really didn't have exposure to that and you don't know where to begin? See, that's where I'm wondering is in education,
Hmm.
you take classes and you learn about these
Right.
subjects, and then you implement them just as you described in your classroom. And so as a parent, you may or may not have been exposed and know how to do it. And so I'm like, "Oh, how do you bridge the gap between the education system and society and then the family units?" That's what I'm
Yeah.
curious about, is how do we do that on a larger scale that's outside of the school system and starts inside the home?
That's a good question, Linda. And I've spoken with parents and have these conversations with them. And what I've done, and I've seen like the progress, is it really starts with self-awareness. So it starts with acknowledging that. And before being able to kind of teach emotional skills, you have to practice noticing your own feelings, right? And you know what I'm saying? I think, you know, whatever parents in the household, they'll say, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, so I'm going to take a deep breath. That will show the child again that emotions are normal. And then you can name the emotions all together. You can help your child then build emotional vocabulary, instead of asking like, what's wrong, or what's the problem? Are you feeling sad, frustrated, or worried? Give the child options, and really try to do things like validate validate emotions in your kid before trying to correct them. But again, I think it really all starts with being self-aware and recognizing that you don't have to be what you've come from, and you can break that generational curse. Like, that's a part of why I named my book Resilience: Breaking the Chains, because you don't have to necessarily be what you were brought up as. You can do so much more. Does that make sense?
It really does, and so what you're saying is there isn't necessarily this formal way of connecting the 3 audiences, is more about embodying it in general And so you're expressing to the parents what it could look like to be that support to their child just by having those conversations. So really the answer to the question I asked is we are able to spread this or have the ripple effect by having those everyday conversations, whether they begin in the school, they begin in the workplace, or they begin in the home, is just continuing to have them, and then they will spread, and then that'll become the culture.
Exactly, Linda. And I also want to create space to recognize that you have to give yourself grace. You have to give yourself grace. Like if you didn't grow up talking about emotions, that very well might feel uncomfortable at first. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to name that that is okay. But the fact that, parents are really trying to be insightful and really trying to be vulnerable enough to say, I'm curious on how to do this means that you're already starting to kind of change that pattern and break those generational chains. And I feel like when people talk about social emotional learning, people think that there's like a perfection monitor. It's not about being perfect. And I really think that it's about doing what you can to be present. So, yeah, really good question, Linda.
I like that you shared that point
Mhm.
about being vulnerable enough to say, "I don't know where to start, but I want to."
Yeah.
Because, as a parent, let's say, you want to be able to impart knowledge to your children, and there's times where you may not have that experience or knowledge, but just saying that I don't know how to necessarily start. I know this is not going to be perfect, but we're going to have this anyway, and we're going to learn together. I think that that is an amazing skill for a parent or anyone to take on. Is I don't have to be perfect. I
Yeah.
may get it wrong, and just stating that's
Mm.
great because as a parent, we all know that we have done it wrong
Yeah.
where you wanted to extend, uh, but do it in a constructive way where there needed to be a redirection, and we may have not done it in the way that was productive, but we did the best we could at that time, and knowing that, yeah, we're gonna try, because trying
Yeah.
is so much better than not making an
Yeah.
effort. And you're right,
Exactly.
giving the grace that,
You have to.
yeah, that we're gonna
Yeah.
learn and that mistakes are part of the learning process.
And that's the thing, Linda. I think we also need to normalize these things. Like we need to normalize giving ourselves grace. We need to normalize like that it's okay to have trauma education and to have difficult conversations, like going to therapy, especially in things like schools and workplaces. Those things are like it's honestly in our society, like those things, I think it's definitely getting better. But I think in our society talking about trauma or talking about therapy equates with being damaged, and that's just not the reality. That's not the truth. And I personally don't feel like healing should be something that we only talk about in crisis. I think it should be a part of everyday culture. Like when I endured my own situation with domestic violence and I almost lost my life, I had to engage in EMDR. And so that's for folks that might not be familiar, that's eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy. And that helped me heal, Linda, in ways that I didn't even think was possible. I was like, and it really helps, the brain reprocess painful memories so they no longer kind of control your emotions. And it doesn't necessarily like erase everything that's happened in the past, but allows you the opportunity to kind of live beyond it. And that's the kind of healing that I want for everybody is to just kind of learn that you have to give yourself grace and it's okay to normalize conversations that might be difficult.
It's
Yeah.
really true,
Yeah,
normalizing difficult conversations
it is.
because the vulnerability, a lot of times, it's not gonna come out for people because there's risk involved in it.
Yeah.
You know, I think what I'd like to do is, if you're open to it, is if you could share, like, a moment where being vulnerable became central to your healing, because
Mhm.
we've kinda touched upon that. Did it happen where you transformed a relationship, an opportunity, or provided a sense of that inner peace when you decided that you would take that risk and become vulnerable?
That's a really good question, Linda. I'm trying to kind of think about hmm, I'm trying to think about like the very moment. I think vulnerability became central to healing when I finally stopped trying to kind of survive in silence, right? So for years, I thought being strong meant keeping everything bottled up inside of me. That's showing up for others while hiding my own pain, right? I told you that I'm a survivor of domestic violence myself. But I recognize that that kind of strength really kept me disconnected from people, disconnected from myself, disconnected from Eugene, you know what I'm saying? And, the turning point really came when I began that EMDR, right? And I began writing Brazilians Breaking the Chains, and putting a story like that on paper forced me to confront the things that I've buried. It was the first time that I truly admitted I'm not okay. And I didn't apologize for that. I embraced that, right? And I recognized that when I was talking to my friends after I endured my situation, and I was like, listen, bro, like I really almost died. Like Eugene could be dead, you know? And to have my friends be like, listen, like Eugene, like, oh my God, like that has happened to me too. It allowed me the opportunity to see myself in different spaces and in different eyes and say, this is bigger than me. And then, when I shared my story in public for the first time, I was terrified. I was really nervous that people were gonna like judge me or see me differently being a survivor of domestic violence. But afterwards, there was this man, he came up to me and he said, Eugene, you just told my story. And that moment right there, Linda, like that changed everything. And it really showed me that being vulnerable, it's like your superpower, it's connection, no? So I say all that to say that vulnerability, it's been every day afterwards. It's been the center of my life, how I live my life, how I show up, how I love, how I lead. It's how I heal. And it's how I help others heal, while recognizing that in order for me to help others heal, I have to work on healing myself, right? So I went through a whole bunch of EMDR sessions because I can't come into this field holding space and helping people if I'm not willing to help myself. And I think it starts there.
Thank you very much for sharing that because what I heard you say is because you went through the trauma, you were disconnected at that time because
Yeah,
you were suffering in silence. And as you moved through and took the risk to even open up to your friends, then that like started the catalyst for being able to be more expressive. And maybe not everyone is going to write a book and speak
yeah,
about their experience. Maybe that's not gonna be their path, but their path could be, I open up to people I feel safe with, and in doing so, my story makes it safe for somebody else to say, "Me too."
exactly.
And so they can open up, and then that builds that connection that you were speaking of. So really, vulnerability is your superpower because when we feel connected, we're able to share some of these things that are going on, and we don't feel like we're all alone in it anymore. And that's the beauty of being able to, work on yourself to find that peace. But the only way we're going to open it up usually is by connecting with another person and then going back and sitting with ourselves and getting connected to ourselves. And so the two working together strengthens relationships with ourselves and others.
You have it absolutely right, Linda. I'm a firm believer that, once you stop pretending and you start just being honest about your pain, and again, you don't have to do it with other people. If you do it with yourself, that's when the real freedom begins. And I have a little brother, so he's 4. I just turned 23 and he's 4. So I really wanted to show him that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to name your emotions because in a society that almost criminalizes men who do that and looks down on men that do that. I want to show him that you don't have to feed into that. It's okay to do so. And I want him to just kind of see that vulnerability is a superpower.
It definitely is. And, Eugene, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to have this conversation today. And I think that the practical advice that you're giving your listeners is it begins with you, and you can
Yeah.
help people in your own family. Would you do me the honor of expanding upon that message of what you're doing for your little brother? Because I think that is the core of where that happens, where all that inner discussions that you've had with yourself expand to others.
Yeah. I think for me, I think it's really important to give back to the community that's going to be here when I'm gone. I recognize that I'm 23 and my brother is 4. I recognize that he's going to grow up in a environment that I won't be a part of. Like, he'll be in the 4th grade, I'll be grown, you know what I'm saying? So, and I even try to show him through play. I try to show him through play that if this car is this way, you can have the mechanic ask the car what's wrong. And it's like they can come out and just have a whole conversation. But I'm teaching him through play, like, okay, this is how you ask what's wrong, how can I help you, and this is how you can respond. And I really try to kind of encourage him, when he kind of is feeling upset. I just go down to his level because I'm much taller than him. He's 4. Even though he's really, really, really tall, and it's really strange. He's really tall. And I kneeled down and I said, okay, buddy, what are you feeling? Talk to me. Are you red? Are you mad? Are you blue? Are you sad? Or are you yellow? Like, are you in the middle? And then he'll tell me, and then we kind of go from there. We'll either go for a walk, or we'll draw a picture, or we'll like jump our sillies out or whatever. Just giving him options so that he can feel his emotions and express them in different ways. And I think that's a really great tool for parents to kind of do as well. If you show them very early, it can be as simple as that.
Well, it can be as simple as that, and I've used that example of naming it and then having the child describe it, and then it became this tool that they can use themselves. They don't need
Yeah.
anyone to sit there with them because it's simple and actionable, and you're right, play is the perfect way to do it, and sometimes as adults, we forget that going back to the basics of when we were that 4-year-old curious child, that we can use
Yeah.
play to solve a lot of our own things, and
Yeah.
I appreciate
Exactly.
that in more ways than one that you've shared that example. Thank you. So, it's been great to hear your thoughts on all of these topics that we've touched today, and we want to thank everyone that's listening, and hopefully that they found the conversation useful. And Eugene, where can people find you if they'd like to get in touch to you to have more of the conversation about social emotional learning or anything else that we've talked today?
Yeah. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Eugene Z Bertrand, and my book, Resilience Breaking the Chains, is in bookstores, Amazon, and Barnes and Nobles.
So if you resonate with this topic or anything we've shared today, or you have any ideas on things you'd like us to talk about in the future, please do get in touch with us. We always love to hear from you. Our details are in the show notes. And that's it for me until next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Masculinity Unmasked podcast. We're so glad you're here. If this episode resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and share it with a friend who needs to hear it. And if you're really feeling the love, we'll be grateful if you could leave us a 5-star rating. It helps more people find the show. Thanks very much for hanging out with us, and we'll see you next time.